The water in the creek is so cold it feels like a physical blow, a constant, biting shock against her chapped skin. Elspeth Monroe, who calls herself Elsie because the name feels plainer, more suited to her life, plunges the stained strips of linen into the current. The milky cloud of blood and grime immediately whips away downstream, a ghost of a thing gone in an instant. She scrubs the cloth against a smooth, flat rock, her knuckles raw and red, the ache in her bones a familiar companion. For 62 days, this has been her life. For 62 days, she has been a bride to a dead man, a nursemaid to his silent, shattered brother, and the unpaid, unrecognized mistress of a ranch that would never be hers. She wrings out the last bandage, the coarse fabric twisting tight in her fists, and watches the clear, icy water drip from it. Every drop feels like a second of her life, seeping away into the hard, unforgiving soil of the Montana Territory. Or so she thought. There's more to Elspeth than meets the eye. Before her true worth and secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The letter had promised a home. More than that, it had promised a life. Daniel Rourke's words, penned in a surprisingly neat hand, had spoken of sweeping valleys, a herd of fine cattle, and a future built under the vast, open sky. For Elsie, trapped in the clamor and soot of a Chicago tenement, sharing a single room with 3 other girls who coughed through the night, the letter was a prayer answered. She was 19, with no family to speak of, and a future that looked as gray as the city sky. She'd packed her one good dress and the few belongings she owned into a worn carpet bag and spent every last cent on a train ticket west. She had imagined her arrival 1,000 times. A shy meeting on a bustling platform, a wagon ride to a sturdy farmhouse, the slow, careful building of a life together. The reality was a plankwood coffin being lowered into the hard ground beside a raw, windswept gravesite. Daniel Rourke, her intended, had been taken by a fever a week before her train even pulled into the dusty outpost of Clearwater. There was no one there to meet her. The station master, a man with a kind, weary face, had been the one to break the news. He'd pointed her toward the Rourke place, a few miles out of town, and offered to quiet his brothers there. Just got back from the war, they say. In a bad way. In a bad way was a charitable description. Sergeant Thomas Rourke was a ghost haunting his dead brother's house. Elsie found him in a narrow bed, his face pale and grim, a thick quilt pulled up to his chin. A sour, medicinal smell hung in the air. His right leg was a mountain range of bandages under the blanket, and his eyes, when they finally flickered open to look at her, were chips of ice. "Who are you?" he had rasped, his voice rough with disuse and pain. "Elspeth Monroe. I was to marry Daniel." The words felt foolish and hollow in the silent, grief-stricken room. He had stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, pity, anger, exhaustion. Then he'd simply closed his eyes again, a clear dismissal. And that was that. She was stranded, a mail-order bride with no groom, no money, and nowhere to go. The station master had offered to help arrange passage back east for her, perhaps on credit with a church charity, but Elsie had looked at the grim cabin, at the specter in the bed, and made a choice. It wasn't a noble choice, not really. It was the choice of a survivor. Going back meant returning to nothing. Staying meant, well, it meant a roof over her head for now. So she stayed. She found the small stack of linens Daniel had bought in anticipation of her arrival and tore them into strips. She found the pump, the wash basin, the half-empty larder. She learned the geography of the small, dark cabin, the loose floorboard by the hearth, the way the wind whistled through a chink in the window frame, the oppressive silence of the man in the bed. He rarely spoke. For the first few weeks, his only communication was a grunt of assent when she brought him broth or a tight-lipped shake of his head. His name, she learned from a framed army commendation on the wall, was Thomas. Sergeant Thomas Rourke, honored for bravery. The man in the bed didn't look brave. He looked broken. His pain was a living thing in the room with them, a third presence that soured the air. In the dead of night, She would hear his sharp, ragged breaths, the muffled groans he couldn't suppress, and she would lie on her own thin pallet on the floor, staring into the darkness, feeling as trapped as he was. Her days fell into a grueling rhythm. Wake before dawn, tend the fire, check on Thomas, changing the dressings on his mangled leg as he stared stonily at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. The doctor from Clearwater came once a week, a brisk, tired man who offered little hope. "It's the fever in the wound that'll kill him if we can't keep it down," he'd said, his eyes scanning Elsie with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "He's lucky to have you, miss. Most would have run." Elsie didn't feel lucky. She felt like a prisoner bound by a promise made to a dead man. The ranch itself was as neglected as its master. Daniel, it turned out, had been a man of grand dreams but little follow-through. The fences sagged, the barn door hung from a single hinge, and the small herd of cattle he'd ridden of was a sorry-looking dozen that seemed to spend most of their time searching for patches of decent grass. The land was beautiful, yes. The valleys did sweep, and the sky was a stunning, endless blue. But beauty didn't fill a stomach or pay a debt. The first sign of external threat came in the form of a man named Silas Croft. He rode up one afternoon on a handsome black gelding, his saddle new and oiled, his clothes clean. He was their nearest neighbor, his prosperous, well-maintained ranch bordering the Rourke property to the east. He was a big man, with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that took in everything at a glance. The peeling paint on the cabin, the lean-to woodpile, Elsie's worn dress. He removed his hat with a flourish. "Mom, Silas Croft, I came to offer my condolences about young Daniel. A tragedy." His voice was smooth, but his eyes were not. They lingered on her, assessing. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," Elsie said, her hands smoothing down her apron, a nervous habit. "Heard his brother made it back," Croft continued, craning his neck to peer toward the cabin's dark doorway. "Though not in one piece, I gather. He is resting." Of course, Croft nodded, though his expression was anything but sympathetic. "It's a hard situation for a young woman to be in. All alone out here. A crippled man to care for." He let the words hang in the air. "This is hard country. A place like this, it needs a strong hand." He paused, stroking his chin. "If you find yourself in a bind, if you decide this is all too much, well, I might be persuaded to take this land off your hands. For a fair price, of course. To help you out." The offer was coated in false generosity, but the core of it was cold and predatory. He saw weakness. He saw an opportunity. He glanced from Elsie to the cabin and back again, a small, knowing smirk playing on his lips. He saw a helpless girl and a dying soldier. He saw an easy meal. "We are managing, Mr. Croft," Elsie said, her voice firmer than she felt. He laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "For now." He tipped his hat again, a gesture of mockery more than respect, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a sense of encroaching dread in his wake. That night, the wind howled louder than usual, and Elsie felt the isolation of the small cabin press in on her like a physical weight. She was not just fighting for a roof over her head anymore. She was standing guard. The crisis came not as a storm or a sickness, but as a quiet, insidious failure. The western fence line, which Elsie knew was weak, finally gave way. She discovered it at dawn, a long section of posts rotted at the base, the wire lying slack and useless on the ground. 3 of their small herd of cattle were gone. Not just any 3, but the healthiest-looking ones, including the one cow that still gave a little milk. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Those cattle were their most valuable asset, the only thing of worth on this broken-down ranch besides the land itself. She hurried back to the cabin, her mind racing. She would have to ride out, track them. But she was a clumsy rider at best, on a sway-backed old mare that was more stubborn than she was. She burst into the cabin, her breath coming in short gasps. The fence is down. 3 of the cattle are gone. Thomas, who had been staring at the ceiling as usual, turned his head on the pillow. For the first time, his icy gaze held a spark of alarm. "Which way?" "The west pasture. They'll be on Croft's land by now, if I don't." "You can't go after them alone," he stated, his voice a low rasp. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, a grimace of pain flashing across his face before he sank back down. The sight of his own helplessness filled the room, thick and suffocating. Frustration radiated from him in waves. Damn it. He began to issue orders from the bed, his voice sharp with urgency and the bitterness of his confinement. Saddle Bessie. Take the rope from the barn. Don't push her too hard on the inclines. Look for tracks near the creek bed. They'll go for water first. Elsie listened, nodding, but his tone chafed. He spoke to her as if she were a witless child, his commands clipped and impatient. A spark of her own frustration ignited. I know they'll go for water, she snapped, her voice tighter than she intended. And I know how to saddle a horse. His eyes narrowed. A tense silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. It was the most they had said to each other in 2 months. She saw the flash of surprise in his expression, the brief acknowledgement that she had a spine. She turned on her heel without another word and marched out to the barn, her anger a welcome heat against the cold morning air. The old mare, Bessie, was as cantankerous as ever, but Elsie managed. She rode out, following Thomas's grudging instructions, which, to her annoyance, were correct. She found the tracks exactly where he'd said they would be, leading down a shallow ravine toward the creek that separated their property from Silas Croft's. The thought of facing Croft again, of having to ask his permission to retrieve their stock, made her stomach clench. She found the cattle not on Croft's land, but tangled in a thicket of thorny brush just shy of the property line. Getting them out was a miserable, scratching, frustrating affair. They were spooked and stubborn, and Bessie seemed to take their side, refusing to cooperate. Elsie's hands were scratched and bleeding. Her dress was torn, and tears of sheer exasperation stung her eyes. But she didn't give up. She talked to the animals in a low, soothing voice, the way she remembered a farmer doing back in a county fair she'd visited as a child. Slowly, painstakingly, she untangled them and hazed them back toward the break in the fence. The sun was high and hot by the time she got them back into the pasture. Her entire body ached. She spent the next 2 hours wrestling with the broken fence, using rocks, salvaged wire, and a strength she didn't know she possessed to create a passable patch. It was ugly, but it was functional. She stumbled back into the cabin near midday, covered in dust and grime, every muscle screaming in protest. Thomas was sitting up, propped against the wall, his face pale with the effort. He had been watching for her through the window. He looked her over, the torn dress, the bloody scratches on her arms, the exhaustion etched on her face. The silence stretched. She expected a critique, another sharp command, or simply the usual blank dismissal. You got the back, he said. It wasn't a question. The fence is mended, she replied, her voice flat. She moved to the water basin, splashing her face, the cool water a blessed relief. She waited. She felt his eyes on her back. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The sharp, impatient edge was gone, replaced by something gruff and low. You did good, Elsie. She froze, her hands still dripping. She turned to look at him. His gaze was direct, without the usual icy wall between them. It was a simple phrase, 3 small words. But in the silence of that cabin, after 2 months of thankless labor and oppressive quiet, they landed like a benediction. It was the first crack in the wall of his bitterness, the first sign that he saw her not as a burden or an interloper, but as a person who had, against the odds, held things together. A fragile truce settled over the room, as tentative and welcome as the first thaw of spring. That grudging compliment became a foundation, a single stone upon which something new and fragile began to be built. The silences between them changed. They were no longer heavy with resentment and grief, but filled with a quiet, observational watchfulness. Elsie found herself noticing small things about Thomas. The way his hands, though weakened by his infirmity, were strong and capable-looking. The network of fine lines around his eyes that hinted at a life lived outdoors before the war had claimed him. The way he tracked her movements around the cabin, his gaze no longer icy, but calculating. as if he were finally taking her measure. The real test, the one that broke down the last of their formal barriers, arrived on the back of a furious thunderstorm. It rolled in from the west one afternoon, the sky turning a bruised, violent purple. The wind shrieked, rattling the cabin on its foundations, and rain came down not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets. Elsie was securing the shutters when she heard it. A steady, rhythmic drip. She turned, her heart sinking. A dark stain was spreading on the ceiling directly above Thomas's bed. Drip, drip, drip. The water landed with sickening precision on the quilt covering his injured leg. "It's leaking," she stated, the obviousness of it sounding absurd in the face of the roaring storm. Thomas craned his neck, looking up at the growing wet patch. Daniel was always meaning to fix that roof. His voice was grim. He tried to shift away from the drips, but a sharp intake of breath and the tightening of his jaw told her the movement had cost him dearly. "We have to move you," she said, her mind racing. "I can't," he started, his pride warring with the undeniable reality of his situation. The bed was heavy, iron-framed. Moving him alone was impossible. Moving the bed with him in it was a Herculean task. "We have to," she repeated, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She grabbed the spare bucket and placed it on the bed to catch the worst of the water, then moved to the head of the bed frame. "I'll take this end. When I lift, you use your good leg and your arms to help slide the bed toward the hearth." He looked at her, doubt and pain etched on his face. But in her eyes, he saw not pity, but a steely resolve. He gave a short, sharp nod. What followed was a clumsy, desperate ballet. Elsie strained, her muscles screaming as she lifted the heavy iron headboard. Thomas grunted with effort, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame, pushing with all his might. The bed scraped and shuddered across the rough floorboards, inch by painful inch. His breath came in ragged pants, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't complain. They were a team, bound by a shared, urgent goal. Finally, they had the bed clear of the leak. Elsie's arms trembled with exhaustion as she let the frame down. She leaned against the wall, panting, her hair plastered to her forehead with rain and sweat. Thomas lay back against his pillows, his eyes closed, his chest heaving. The only sounds in the cabin were their shared, ragged breathing and the drumming of the storm outside. The intimacy of the moment was jarring. They had fought a battle together, a small, domestic war against the elements. She had seen his weakness, his pain, his utter reliance on her. He had seen her strength, her grit, her refusal to be beaten. When he opened his eyes, the wall was gone. There was only a man, exhausted and vulnerable, looking at a woman who was equally spent but undefeated. "Thank you," he murmured, the words barely a whisper. In the days that followed, a new routine settled in. As Thomas's strength slowly returned, he began to contribute in the only ways he could. He showed her how to properly sharpen the kitchen knives. He taught her how to mend a harness, his long-fingered hands demonstrating the intricate stitches while she copied his movements. One evening, driven by the need for something, anything, to occupy his mind, she brought him a small box she had found tucked away in a trunk. It contained Daniel's ranch ledgers. "I can't make sense of these," she confessed, laying the leather-bound book on the quilt beside him. "The numbers are all jumbled." He picked it up, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he suspected, Daniel's bookkeeping was as haphazard as his fence mending. But Thomas understood it. He began to talk, his voice low and steady, explaining the entries, the debts, the cryptic notes in the margins. He spoke of calving seasons and feed costs, of the loan from the bank in Clearwater, and of the bigger, more pressing mortgage held against the land itself. As he spoke, Elsie listened, not just to the words but to the tone. He knew this life. He understood the rhythms of the land, the hard calculus of sun and rain and debt. She, in turn, showed a surprising aptitude for the numbers, her mind quick and clear. She began to organize the chaotic entries onto fresh sheets of paper, creating a clear picture of their financial state. It was a bleak picture. The ranch was deeply in debt, but for the first time, it was a known quantity, a dragon they could see and measure. They worked late into the nights by lamplight, their heads bent together over the ledger, a partnership forged in columns of red and black ink. It was during one of these sessions that Silas Croft chose to make his second appearance. He didn't bother knocking, simply filled the doorway with his bulk, his shadow falling over them. "Well now, isn't this cozy?" he drawled, his eyes taking in the scene. Elsie and Thomas at the table, the ledger between them, their heads close together. His gaze was oily and insinuating. "Playing house, are we?" Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes turning to Flint. "State your business, Croft." Croft's smirk widened. He directed his words to Elsie, ignoring Thomas as if he were a piece of furniture. "I had a word with Mr. Abernathy at the bank. He's getting concerned about the loan Daniel took out. Says a payment is long overdue." He looked from Elsie's determined face to Thomas's useless leg. "Abernathy agrees with me. This is no place for a lone woman and an invalid. He's thinking of calling in the note." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a naked declaration of war. Croft was using his influence to squeeze them out. "You'll get your payment," Elsie said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to keep it steady. Croft laughed. "With what? I hear your milk cow's gone dry, and your herd's looking more like coyote bait every day." He took a step into the room, his presence sucking the air from it. "The offer stands. I'll take this heap of scrap off your hands, give you enough to get on a train, and send you back where you belong. And him," he jerked his chin toward Thomas, "he can go to a soldier's home. They have places for men like him." A low, dangerous sound rumbled in Thomas's chest. "Get out," he said, his voice quiet but vibrating with a tightly controlled rage. "I'm just trying to be neighborly," Croft said, spreading his hands in a parody of innocence. "Get out." Croft held his gaze for a long moment, then shrugged, his smirk returning. "You'll come around. When the bank sends the foreclosure notice, you'll see I'm your only option." He turned and left, leaving a poisonous silence in his wake. Elsie sank onto her stool, the fight going out of her. It was hopeless. Croft was right. They had nothing. She looked at Thomas, expecting to see defeat in his eyes. Instead, she saw a cold, hard fire. The soldier was still there, buried beneath the pain and the brokenness. And he was looking at Croft's retreating back, as if it were an enemy position he intended to take. The threat from Silas Croft cast a long, dark shadow over the small cabin. A sense of borrowed time settled in. Elsie worked with a quiet, desperate fervor, trying to wring some semblance of order and productivity from the neglected ranch. She repaired the chicken coop, planted a small vegetable garden near the house, and spent hours in the evenings poring over the ledgers, searching for some miscalculation, some forgotten asset that could save them. Thomas watched her. His leg was healing, the deep, angry wound slowly closing, the fevers becoming less frequent. He was able to sit in a chair by the fire now, his leg propped up on a stool. His days were spent in enforced stillness, a torment for a man of action, but it gave him ample time to observe. He saw the way Elsie's hands, no longer soft and pale from city life, were now calloused and capable. He saw the set of her jaw when she wrestled with a stubborn task, the smudge of dirt on her cheek she was too busy to notice, the deep weariness in her eyes at the end of the day that she never once complained about. One night was particularly bad for him. The pain returned with a vengeance, a deep, throbbing agony that medication couldn't touch. A fever set in, and with it the delirium. Elsie was up with him all night, bathing his face with cool cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He tossed and turned, his mind lost in the smoky haze of memory and pain. He mumbled names she didn't know, men from his company, she presumed. He spoke of gunfire and dust, his voice tight with a remembered terror. Then, in a moment of startling clarity, his eyes focused on her. He reached out, his hand surprisingly strong, and gripped her arm. "I'm sorry, Anna," he whispered, his voice thick with anguish. "I should have been there." Elsie froze. The name hung in the air between them. Anna. A wife? A sweetheart? She felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a strange, sharp jealousy. She gently freed her arm. "It's Elsie," she said softly. "You're safe, Thomas. "You're home." His eyes clouded over again, and he slipped back into his fevered dreams, but the moment lingered. She had seen past the gruff soldier, past the bitter invalid, and glimpsed the man underneath, a man who carried not just physical wounds, but deep, unhealed griefs of his own. Her feelings for him, which had started as a sense of duty and then shifted to a fragile alliance, were changing again. A fierce, protective compassion took root in her heart. This broken man, this failing ranch, they were hers to defend. As he recovered from that night, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once more. A certain shyness entered their interactions. He seemed embarrassed by his moment of weakness, and she was careful not to mention it. To fill the long, quiet hours of his convalescence, Thomas took up whittling. He had always been clever with his hands. He used his pocket knife and scraps of wood from the kindling box to carve small, intricate figures. He started with a lopsided horse, then a passable dog. One afternoon, as she was mending one of his shirts by the fire, he held something out to her without a word. She looked up and saw a small, beautifully carved bird resting in his palm. It was a sparrow, its head cocked to one side, its tiny form captured with astonishing life and detail. She reached out and took it. The wood was smooth and warm from his hand. It was a gift, a peace offering, an apology for his harshness, and a thank you for her care, all conveyed in a silent piece of wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her throat tight. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire, a faint flush on his cheeks. Elsie closed her fingers around the small bird and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. It felt as precious as a diamond. From that day on, it never left her. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of the male rider a week later. He brought supplies from Clearwater in a single, ominous-looking envelope. It was from the bank. Thomas took it, his face grim, and broke the seal. Elsie watched him, her hands clenched in her apron, the small wooden bird a hard knot against her stomach. He read the letter, his expression hardening into a mask of stone. When he was done, he didn't need to say a word. She could see the verdict in his eyes. "They're calling the loan," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The one Croft mentioned. We have 30 days to pay $200, or they begin foreclosure proceedings." $200. He might as well have said $2 million. It was an impossible sum. Elsie sank onto the bench by the door, the strength draining from her legs. 30 days. Croft had won. It was over. All her work, her scrubbing and mending and worrying, had been for nothing. She would be homeless, sent back to the gray, hopeless life she had fled. Thomas would be sent to a soldier's home, a place of last resort for broken men. A profound, suffocating despair filled the cabin. Elsie stared at her hands, at the calluses and broken nails. She had tried so hard. She had allowed a tiny, foolish seed of hope to sprout in this barren ground, and now it was being ripped out by the roots. She looked over at Thomas. He was staring into the fire, the banker's letter crumpled in his fist, the soldier's mask firmly back in place. But she saw the flicker of defeat in his eyes, and it broke her heart. The 30-day deadline hung over the cabin like a guillotine. The quiet understanding they had built dissipated, replaced by a tense, desperate anxiety. Elsie went about her chores with a heavy heart, the future a blank wall she couldn't see beyond. She began to mentally prepare herself for the end. She pictured herself on the train platform again, this time with no hope at all. The thought was a cold, hard knot in her chest. One afternoon, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere in the cabin any longer, she walked to the small chest that held her meager belongings. She pulled out her carpet bag and set it on her pallet. With slow, deliberate movements, she began to fold her spare dress, her fingers tracing the worn fabric. It was a gesture of resignation, an admission of defeat. If she had to leave, she would do so with what little dignity she had left. Thomas, who had been sitting by the window, turned his head. He had been getting stronger each day, now able to move around the small cabin with the aid of a rough-hewn crutch. He watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Packing," she replied without looking at him. There's no sense in waiting until the last day. The silence that followed was so profound, she could hear the hiss of the sap in the firewood. She expected him to nod in grim agreement, to retreat back into his own bitter solitude. Instead, she heard the thump and scrape of his crutch on the floorboards as he moved toward the large, iron-strapped trunk that had belonged to his parents. "Stop," he said. The word was so soft, yet so commanding, that she froze, her hand still on her dress. She turned to look at him. He was kneeling, with great difficulty, in front of the trunk. He worked the latch and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and old memories filled the room. He rummaged inside, past folded quilts and his father's Sunday suit, until he pulled out a small, metal lockbox. He found the key on a ring in his pocket and opened it. He took out a single, folded document. It was yellowed with age, its creases worn soft. He pushed himself back to his feet, using the crutch for support, and limped to the table where they had spent so many hours hunched over the ledgers. He sat down heavily in his chair. "The ink," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Mystified, Elsie retrieved the bottle of ink and the pen from the mantelpiece. She set them on the table before him. He unfolded the document with deliberate care. It was the deed to the ranch. His name, Thomas Rourke, was listed as the sole heir and owner, a fact established by the circuit judge after Daniel's death. He dipped the pen in the ink, the scratch of the nib loud in the silent room. Then, with a steady, determined hand that betrayed no hint of his physical weakness, he signed his name at the bottom of the document, in the space designated for transfer of ownership. And on the line below, in the space for the recipient, he wrote 2 words, Elspeth Monroe. He looked up at her, his expression one of fierce, undeniable resolve. He pushed the deed across the table toward her. "It's yours, Elsie," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "My brother promised you a home. I'll see that promise kept. Croft and the bank can't throw the owner off her own land." Elsie stared at the paper, at her name written in his strong, clear hand. The ink was still wet. Her mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his action. He had given her everything. The land, the cabin, the debt, all of it. He had disarmed himself, handing her all the power, all the control. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was a profound act of trust, a declaration louder than any words of affection he could ever speak. It was his way of saying he saw her, he valued her, he would not let her be cast aside. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. They weren't tears of sorrow or despair, but of overwhelming, heart-stopping gratitude. She looked from the deed to his face, and for the first time, she let him see past her own walls, let him see the depths of the emotion churning within her. In that moment, the last of the barriers between the injured soldier and the mail-order bride crumbled into dust. The day of reckoning arrived 2 weeks later, on a morning so bright and clear it felt like a mockery. Silas Croft did not come alone. He rode up with Mr. Abernathy, the banker, a small, pinched man who looked deeply uncomfortable. They dismounted and strode toward the cabin door with an air of grim finality. Croft's face was a mask of smug triumph. They didn't knock. Croft pushed the door open and stepped inside, his bulk filling the space. Abernathy followed hesitantly behind him. "Morning, ma'am," Croft said, his tone dripping with false politeness as he addressed Elsie, who stood waiting by the hearth. "The 30 days are up. Mr. Abernathy is here to serve the papers. I'm afraid it's time for you to be on your way." Elsie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. In her hand, she clutched the folded deed. Thomas sat at the table, his crutch leaning beside him, his face calm and watchful. "I don't believe I will be going anywhere, Mr. Croft," Elsie said, her voice clear and steady. She took a step forward, moving to stand between Croft and Thomas. "This is my ranch now." Croft let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Is that so? Playing make-believe, are we?" He turned his sneer on Thomas. "Rourke, have you gone mad? Filling the poor girl's head with nonsense. A woman can't hold a deed. She has no standing." "On the contrary," Thomas said, his voice cutting through Croft's bluster like a razor. "The deed is perfectly legal. Signed, sealed, and witnessed. Witnessed, Croft scoffed. By who? The chickens. By Dr. Miller, Thomas said calmly. On his last visit, he was happy to oblige. Said it was the most sensible thing he'd seen done all year. Abernathy, the banker, blinked, his discomfort growing visibly. He looked from Thomas's implacable face to the determined woman standing before him. The deed is valid, Mr. Croft, Thomas continued, his voice hardening. Elspeth Monroe is the sole and legal owner of this land. Any business you have concerning this property is with her. Croft's face contorted with rage. His carefully laid plan was unraveling before his eyes. He lost his composure, his true, venomous nature spilling out. This is an outrage. You'd give your family's legacy to her? A penniless mail-order bride from some city slum? She tricked you, you crippled fool. Took advantage of your condition. That's enough, Silas, Abernathy warned, his face pale. But Croft was beyond reason. He pointed a trembling finger at Elsie. She has nothing. She knows nothing. She'll run this place into the ground in a month. That woman, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as he pushed himself to his feet, leaning on his crutch but standing tall. That woman saved my life when men like you would have left me for dead. She held this ranch together with her bare hands while you circled it like a vulture waiting for a meal. She has more grit, more honor, and more right to this land than you will ever have. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire that made Croft instinctively recoil. She has earned it, 10 times over. The force of his words silenced the room. In that moment, Elsie felt a surge of strength, of pride. She stepped forward, unfolding the deed and laying it on the table for Abernathy to see. Then she looked the banker squarely in the eye. Mr. Abernathy, she began, her voice gaining confidence with every word. I have been over the ledgers. The debt is $200. I do not have it. Not today. She saw Croft's smirk begin to return. But, she continued, the spring calves will be ready for sale in 2 months. They should fetch a fair price. And I have found an error in my favor in Daniel's account with the feed store, which will free up a small amount of cash. I am proposing a payment of $50 in 30 days and the remainder of the balance, with interest after the cattle sale. She laid out her plan, citing figures and dates from memory, her grasp of the ranch's financial situation clear and undeniable. She was no longer a frightened girl, but a landowner defending her property. Abernathy stared at her, then at the meticulously organized papers she had prepared, which she now placed on the table. He looked at Croft's sputtering, furious face, and then at Thomas Rourke, who stood guard over his unlikely champion. The banker was a man of business, not a bully. He saw a viable plan from a competent owner, and he saw the greedy machinations of Silas Croft for what they were. Your proposal seems reasonable, Mrs. Monroe, Abernathy said, pointedly using her name. The bank will accept your terms. Defeat washed over Silas Croft's face, leaving it slack and mottled. He had been outmaneuvered, his power broken by the very people he had deemed weak and insignificant. He shot a look of pure hatred at Elsie and Thomas, then spun on his heel and stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, gathering his papers. I will have the new terms drawn up. Good day to you, Mrs. Monroe. Mr. Rourke, he tipped his hat, a gesture of genuine respect this time, and followed Croft out into the bright sunshine, leaving victory and a profound silence in his wake. The sound of the departing horses faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the country day. Elsie and Thomas stood in the middle of the small cabin, the air electric with all that had just happened, with all that remained unspoken. The deed lay on the table between them, a silent testament to the battle they had just won together. Elsie's hands were trembling. She finally looked at Thomas, truly looked at him, and saw not the invalid or the soldier, but the man who had given her a shield, a sword, and a home, all with a single signature. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, her voice thick. He met her gaze, his own eyes dark with an emotion she was just beginning to understand. Yes, Elsie, he said softly. I did. The space between them felt charged, a live wire of hope and possibility. She walked back to the table and picked up the deed. For a long moment, she held it, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of his trust. Then, she held it out to him. He looked at it, confused. "It's yours." "No," she said, her voice finding its strength again. She took a step closer and pushed the paper back across the table, toward his side. "A ranch this size, with so much to be done. It's too much for one person." Her eyes held his, conveying a message far deeper than her words. "It needs a partnership." He looked down at the deed, then back up at her face. A slow, genuine smile transformed his features, erasing the last traces of pain and bitterness. He reached out, not to take the paper, but to place his hand over hers where it rested on the document. His touch was warm and firm, a silent agreement. "That it does," he said. He stood, his hand still covering hers, and together they walked to the open doorway. They stood side by side on the threshold, shoulder to shoulder, looking out not at a broken-down tract of land, but at a future. The sun was warm on their faces, the valley spread out before them, vast and promising. It was not a tidy ending, but a true beginning, forged in hardship, sealed with trust, and blooming, at last, with hope. He was no longer just the injured soldier, and she was no longer the bride who washed bandages in a creek. They were partners, looking out at their home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.